Okay, well, I'm sat today talking all the way on via Skype to Skye Cleary in New York, who works at Columbia University and Barnard College there in New York, and interestingly to me and my students has written a book called Existentialism and Romantic Love. Thank you for talking to us.
Thank you for having me.
And that title, I thought, was it was really interesting to me because it was about existentialism that I'm really interested in, but also rather than connecting it with kind of love in some very platonic, kind of pure form sense, putting the word romantic in front of it is provides it with an interest in kind of the kind of love most people seek to experience sometimes in their life. So with that kind of in mind, what generally kind of approach do you want to take in the book?
Okay, so what I was interested in with my book was where the frustrations and disappointments in romantic relationships come from. Because there's this ideal that romantic love is about finding the one and living happily ever after, but it's looking around me and realizing that, it's rarely one, it's rarely always happy, and it's rarely forever. So that's where my thinking started from. And I was quite intrigued by something Irving Singer wrote, which was that in love, the freedom we give up is compensated by the love we receive in return. And I was just intrigued by this equation, and I'm like, well, how much freedom is okay to give up, and what does that look like, and how do you even make the choices about that? And that started my thinking about freedom.
It seems very transactional.
It does a little bit, yeah, and I guess it was at a time in my life when I was thinking about relationships and thinking about freedom and wanting to do my PhD and thinking and trying to integrate that with my own relationships. And about that time also, a book by Hazel Rowley called Tête-à-Tête came out, which was on the life of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. And I kind of thought that they were exploring the same kind of questions that I was interested in. So that launched my kind of exploration into existentialism, freedom, and love. But I guess what I found really interesting, like looking at freedom, was that when we talk about it, where we need to look at it in two different dimensions. It's, on the one hand, freedom from things like oppression or freedom from arranged marriages, but also another dimension is freedom to. What do we have the freedom to do? What power do we have? And so, kind of skipping to the conclusion of my book, what I started to realize was that from an existential perspective, it's about to create authentic relationships. It's about freeing ourselves from these kind of preconceived ideas about what romantic love should be like. I mean, we're bombarded by all sorts of images, like from basically every Hollywood romantic comedy, and expectations from our parents or expectations from society. With the Supreme Court decision on same-sex marriage, the judge said, the highest ideal of love is marriage. And it's like, is it? Like, I'm not sure. I wasn't sure that was the case. So on the one hand, it's being free from those kind of expectations, as well as being free from being a slave to our passions, because love is so intoxicating, overwhelming, and it feels like it's out of our control.
Absolutely.
But kind of the existential view is like, well, no, we can choose our behavior, and we should choose our behavior, and so keep like that in check. And so once we're free from those things, then we're free to create authentically meaningful relationships.
And so in looking at that, clearly I think I'm sympathetic to the view that existentialism is actually very useful in thinking about that, because it gets us to think or to rethink perhaps some of our more lazy assumptions about freedom. We tend to think freedom is not being restricted in any way. And that's, one of Sartre's books, the character is always trying to keep his freedom rather than commit to his girlfriend or his mistress or his partner, because he's scared that he'll lose his freedom, rather than actually the committing being an expression of his freedom, or an embracing of his freedom. So I think that kind of existentialism as a meditation on freedom is really interesting. See it kind of pull back to romantic love makes a lot of sense, I think. So Sartre clearly and Simone de Beauvoir. What other philosophers did you find kind of useful?
So I started off looking at Max Stirner and Soren Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche as kind of the precursors to existentialism. Not that they traditionally considered existentialists in their own right, although Kierkegaard probably the first existentialist, but because they contribute to existential thinking. So Max Stirner was, I thought, important because he kind of starts off this whole idea of authenticity. He calls it omness. So for him, romantic love is an appreciation of an individual's unique qualities. And he talks about it in terms of, a little bit like a bottle of wine. You see a bottle of wine, it's got a beautiful label, it tastes beautiful, maybe it's intoxicating, but, maybe you grow sick of the wine, maybe you grow bored with it, maybe the wine inside goes sour. And he's like, that's like relationships. So one of the dominant ideas about love is that because we've loved someone once, we're expected to love them forever. And love becomes a kind of duty or something we owe the other person. So he's like, let's free ourselves from those kind of ideas. And he was actually one of the first ones to say, or the first one, I think, to say man has killed God. And that's something normally attributed to Nietzsche. But the implication of that is that without inherent values and morals in the world, it's up to us to choose our own meaning in life. And he said, well, the best kind of meaning in life is to squander it. Let's squeeze as much as we can out of life, burn it like a candle at both ends. We're here for a good time, not a long time. And so let's get value out of ourselves. And love is one of the best ways to get value out of ourselves and to enrich our lives. And love is amazing, so do that.
And that's really kind of positive take on it. Did you find in looking at Nietzsche that he was as positive? He romantically seemed to have a lot of disappointment and kind of hopes that ended up being kind of dashed by reality.
Yeah, he did. I think he proposed at least 2 or 3 times.
Yeah. Never ended well.
Were unavailable, or had a crush on Wagner's life. So yeah, he didn't have much luck with women. And in fact, you've probably heard, there's some suggestion that maybe he was homosexual, and so that's why he didn't have luck with women. But that's kind of speculative. And I do think Nietzsche is fairly negative on love. He says love is war and a deadly hatred between the sexes because we're will to power and we crave total control over one another. And he says, love is frivolous and it's a distraction from striving towards the ideal of the Übermensch.
It might explain a certain amount of why he doesn't do so well, I think, in that world.
Yeah. And he says, in love, we try to want to cage one another or stop one another from doing things. And I love this analogy he uses of a tree. And he's like, lovers can be like ivy growing on trees and stopping them from growing. But he said that's why he kind of tended towards the ideal of friendship, or the ancient Greek ideal of friendship, where friends support one another and encourage each other, educate and push one another to be better people. And he basically thought that most lovers couldn't be capable of that. Although there is some suggestion in his writing that maybe it's possible to reconcile kind of love and friendship at the same time.
So that's quite a lot to kind of start out with. So you kind of got the early existentialists, the people who laid the foundations for existentialism, I guess, kind of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and people. And then beyond that, in terms of, did you move straight to the kind of French approach of the Sartre and people? And do you talk about Camus?
Not so much.
Someone who doesn't consider themselves an existentialist, but we romanticise hugely anyway as one.
Yes, exactly. And the other thing is, I guess he doesn't talk quite so much about love. I mean, he does a little bit, but I was looking mostly for the people who talk a lot about love.
Yeah,
and Sartre and Beauvoir tended to do that a lot.
They live it as well as talk it in some various ways.
Exactly, and they told everyone about it in there, published their letters and autobiographies, and wrote novels based on their lives. So, I think they kind of invite us to look at their lives as a living example of how they tried to live their philosophy, even though they both claim that they were never authentic. They were trying to point the way to other people, although they did strive towards being authentic.
I guess that's that existentialist idea that kind of authenticity is a goal, not something you're going to reach in your life. It's more about kind of using it as a kind of waymarker or some sense to try and orientate yourself. in doing all this work and thinking through it, the conceptual aspect, obviously, as a philosopher, comes out as something you're trying to investigate. But also, something you've said has been that you're interested in kind of combating this kind of idealization of romance, that we'll get through our kind of teens, then we'll get into our 20s, we'll meet our soulmate, who's the perfect person for us, and marry, and then live till one of us dies in our 70s in this perfect life. And I've seen, that clearly doesn't match with much reality of many people. But do you think that idea in itself is kind of harmful to people? It's kind of a problematic kind of ideal.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just it's an illusion. Like, there is no perfect match. We're distracted by finding our other half, and the key word being finding, like as if they're out there somewhere looking for us. Whereas the existential approach says, well, forget that idea of finding the soulmate or perfect match or whatever. Let's focus on creating great relationships. So existential philosophy is a philosophy of action. It's like, let's focus on the choices we can make. They're not so caught up with why we fall in love, but their idea is that, okay, once we do fall in love, let's think about what we can do to make that a great relationship. And harmony is never given. Simone de Beauvoir says we always have to work for it. But we expect, like, once we find love, it's going to be easy. But that's not the way it works. Or we expect that once we make that leap into a relationship, that it's sort of smooth sailing from there. But one of the things they reiterate is that love is a series of choices. Every day, every moment, we choose to be in a relationship. We choose ourselves as people who love someone else and who kind of project ourselves into the future with the intentions of being with that person in the future. So it's very much dominated by this idea of choice, not serendipity, as the kind of the romantic narrative would have us believe.
And that brings with it the other kind of twin aspect of existentialism, which is responsibility. Because often, if you listen to romantic kind of literature and that kind of worldview, there's quite often a position that people can't help it. When people fall in love with people they don't want to fall, or they shouldn't fall in love with things, there's this idea that somehow it's being done to them. The way that you describe it, of course, is very much about, like existentialists talk about, the creation of value, and talk about the creation of relationships. So that seems to go against this popular conception that love is something that happens to us, whether we want it to or not, and that one day we'll be walking along and see somebody across a kind of crowded cafe and bang, that'll be it. We won't be able to help it. We'll have to end the relationship we're in and start it because this thing has happened to us that we can't help. And that's quite attractive anyway, because it might solve all our problems, but also, I guess, because it's not our fault that we've betrayed people or broken promises or done things. But the existential view seems very much in opposition to this idea that it can happen to us.
Yeah, definitely. It's certainly something that, as I mentioned, they're kind of quiet on why we fall in love or who we're attracted to. But the thing is, we might see someone in a crowded cafe and think they look attractive, but we can choose whether to go up to them and talk to them. We can choose whether to give them our number. We can choose whether to go on a date with them. We can choose how to behave in their presence, choose whether to marry them. Like, these are all conscious decisions. So, it's not completely letting go of this passionate, romantic, intoxicating, overwhelming feeling. The existentials are like, that's amazing, let's hold on to that. But let's balance it also with this other idea that we can control our behavior and we're responsible for our behavior. So crimes of passion, that's there are no excuses in the existential world. We're responsible for all those choices. And Nietzsche talks about it in terms of the Dionysian and the Apollonian. Yes, we've got to be, we can be passionate and irrational and emotional, but also balancing in concert with reason.
So that excuse that you hear people occasionally say when they've been caught out in something, it just happened, isn't going to make much headway with existentialists.
Yeah, exactly. Well, what just happened? It just happened that you chose to pursue a relationship with this person. They would say, we're responsible for them, for those passions, and we are free to choose the relationship and choose our behavior. And this is why, kind of in my conclusion, I talk about, freeing ourselves from those lusty impulses and that kind of hedonistic, immature kind of behavior where we're slaves to our sexual desires. And Kierkegaard, for example, talks about it in terms of Don Giovanni, who runs around, a slave to his sexual impulses. And Kierkegaard says, well, no, that's a very childlike, aesthetic lower sphere of existence. And what we need to do is kind of leap to a higher sphere and make a commitment and turn love into a duty in that higher ethical sphere to make love more mature and secure. Although he actually ended up saying it's not that secure, we have to leap to the religious in the end.
Yeah, but it kind of goes that way. And it's kind of in conclusion, really, I was just sort of thinking, after you've kind of come to those conclusions, and now when talking with students and working with young people at university and things, they often, and as an age where people are kind of entering into relationships, thinking about their future relationships, I wonder how much kind of you feel it kind of brings to a position where you've got a kind of practical advice of young people who are looking at making relationships, having kind of early relationships or their first kind of long-term serious relationships, how the kind of ideas you've been exploring translate into kind of advice for them or things for them to reflect on.
Okay, well, I would suggest maybe 5 things. First of all, remember that love is a choice, like we've talked about. It might feel overwhelming, but know that our behavior is a choice and that we have control over and that we're responsible for. I think, second of all, know that love is horrible. It can be torturous. There's a lot of anxiety involved in love. Yes, it's beautiful and amazing, but it can be torturous not to know how much the other person loves us back. How long's the relationship going to last? When's it going to end? And because the existential view is that we are free to be in relationships, we're also free to leave. And that's a very scary thought. I think, so thirdly, forget the idea of finding the one. There is no soulmate out there. And so forget about the finding and focus on the creating great relationships. Also, fourth, know that romance, or this passionate phase, it wears off. I was looking at some of the kind of neuroscience experiments, and they suggest these kind of intoxicating feelings last somewhere between 6 months and 24 months if you're lucky. But the point is that those initial feelings will fade. Passion fades because of familiarity and habits. Maybe the relationship transitions into sort of more companionate love. But just expecting that and knowing that it might well happen, and going back to this idea of creating relationships, like it takes work to keep that passion alive and keep making the relationship romantic. But it also means that the existentialists basically thought marriage was absurd because it's based on a feeling that's going to wear off. So let's either build that into our expectations, which is why most of them didn't marry. Although Max Stirner married twice, but he didn't take it very seriously. Or if we're going to, Nietzsche and Kierkegaard kind of emphasize this idea, look, if you're going to go into marriage, you're making a commitment, stick to it, and make sure it works. But Nietzsche said, look, okay, maybe the relationship's not going to work out and you're causing a whole lot of agony and pain to everybody around you, so just end it quickly and move on. And I think that the fifth thing that is most important is around the idea of authenticity, and not to forget yourself, not to give up your independent projects. Romantic relationships are, a combination of sharing lives, of creating kind of an interdependence or some kind of union or a merger, and that's fine. But as long as we recognize that we're all individuals, we have different interests. Yes, let's have some shared goals. Some people talked about, well, maybe it's a home, maybe it's having children, like whatever it is, like having that shared goal together, that will make the relationship stronger. But also, don't give up your independent interests outside the relationship, and make sure you can keep pursuing your own passions and developing your own self, and not giving up everything like to be in that relationship. And that requires a lot of generosity and allowing each other kind of freedom to do that, and overcoming these kind of possessive power games, because it's scary to let your lover go off and do things on their own without you. And sometimes lovers don't want to do that, and we try and kind of keep each other close, and that can be really comforting, like to be close to one another in your arms. But Simone de Beauvoir especially talked about it's very important to be kind of a fully human and a full person, to be able to be self-sufficient as well as in the relationship.
That sounds like quite good advice, and I think our students would do very well if they follow at least even some of those 5. Well, I'm very much looking forward to reading the book when it finally arrives in our library, and thank you ever so much for talking to us today.
Oh, thanks very much, Dave.